So welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, September 3rd, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the battleground or not so battleground state of New Hampshire and how an internal insider email has been leaked to the press, to the Boston Globe, from a Trump campaign staffer who says that New Hampshire is, quote, no longer winnable, and they're pulling back from the state at large. Donald Trump's campaign has seen a wide range of times where they have invested and pulled back from many battleground states over the past two election cycles. Back in 2020 and 2016, the Trump team had decided at different instances to pull out ads from states that they were going to win or ultimately knew they were going to lose. But this early on in the campaign season, to be seeing an internal email getting leaked to the press regarding Donald Trump's involvement in the state of New Hampshire is a warning sign for the future of the Trump campaign. And while the odds here are very much larger for Donald Trump than they were in the 2020 election, I do not believe New Hampshire is a state that Donald Trump is going to come within a healthy margin of winning and is actually going to likely lose the state by potentially even more than he did in the 2020 presidential election. Now, New Hampshire hasn't always been this way, where it's been a state where Donald Trump really did not contest. In 2016, the Trump team did multiple visits to New Hampshire. This was actually a state that put him right in the front-runner running status in the New Hampshire GOP primary back in 2016. And then came time for the general election. Donald Trump came within less than a point of then-Secretary Hillary Clinton in this New Hampshire race, a race that was decided by over, 500,000 votes at large, decided by less than 4,000. And so New Hampshire was a state that Republicans put on their radar for 2018 and 2020, believing that in the right circumstance, New Hampshire could be more competitive in future elections. But then came the 2020 presidential election, which was a real wake-up call for Republicans across the state that Donald Trump might have only done well in 2016, not because Donald Trump was a uniquely strong candidate who ended up actually receiving less of the vote in New Hampshire than he did in 2016, but rather that Hillary Clinton may not have been as palatable or electable to the voters in New Hampshire as Joe Biden was, or practically any other Democrat. The 2020 election went to show that New Hampshire, alongside many other states, returned to their Democratic roots. That although the Trump campaign also invested in the state, that their absence in the final 3-4 weeks of the campaign season really proved that the results that we saw on Election Day were in line with what we knew in the moments the Donald Trump campaign decided to pull out. I remember I made videos back in 2020 talking about how Donald Trump's campaign pulled out of New Hampshire. You can go back and see around October 5th, October 10th, around October 15th, in the earlier stages of October to mid-October, that the Trump team was starting to pull television ads. The Biden campaign had out-fundraised them by $100 million or so, and it looked like the Trump team was really figuring out where do we spend the most amount of money in the least amount of time, right? So where were they focused on? States like Florida and North Carolina and Georgia. And where did they pull out of? Iowa, Ohio, and New Hampshire. And these were states on one end that the Trump team, I'm sure, saw internal data that said, we will win Iowa, we will win Ohio, but we will lose New Hampshire. And now it's time to focus our resources elsewhere. And in a way, if this was a winning campaign, that would largely be seen as a smart political strategy. But Democrats in the Biden campaign had enough funding that they didn't need to pull their ads in any state. They continued to invest in the Rust Belt. They continued to invest in the Sun Belt. They continued to go on the offense in states like Ohio, Iowa, North Carolina, Florida, and Texas. And while they may not have been able to win all of those states, it still was putting Republicans on their toes to a point where Trump's team had to pull out advertisement spending from some of these states and now spend it on the battleground states because they were being pressed from all sides. And they would rather lose New Hampshire and cede it to the Democrats than continue fighting for it and lose another battleground state because they couldn't have spent that $10 million in that same battleground state. And so New Hampshire this time, I think we're starting to see something very similar happen, where we're finding that the Trump team, at least internally, and this is according to a member of the Trump staff, that is saying, this campaign in New Hampshire likely isn't going to go to the Republican Party. And this comes from someone who's actually had a long history in the New Hampshire GOP. For all intents and purposes, what we have found from this email is that the Boston Globe, based on what they acquired, they cited internal and external polling data that showed that Trump was no longer a viable candidate in the state of New Hampshire. Now, don't get me wrong. I think the Trump team will still continue to put ads up in the state because I'm in Boston and I see the New Hampshire media markets where they do, in fact, invest in advertisements in the state. But the extent at which the Kamala Harris campaign has invested in the state really puts the Republican Party to shame when it comes down to the amount of funding and enthusiasm and resources that the Kamala Harris campaign is putting into New Hampshire, and really does sort of explain why, in fact, the Trump team may no longer see New Hampshire, and does, again, build into that narrative that Trump does not believe New Hampshire is a viable strategy for victory. The campaign has really narrowed down also to 7 battleground states. The team here from both sides of the aisle have sort of come together and said, these are the 7 states we are going to focus on: Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Notably absent, the state of New Hampshire. And I think Republicans for a while did believe that under Biden, they did have a shot at winning in the state of New Hampshire. After Biden's debate performance, it was very much within reach, seemingly at least within reach, for the Republican Party. Right after that debate performance, New Hampshire went right back into being in play for the National Republican Party. They started reinvesting resources, advertisement spending, all of these necessary things that you need to win a battleground state. They started putting it back in New Hampshire. And you started to see some of the earlier stages of them pulling out of New Hampshire. I mean, when you take a look at really the analysis of does Donald Trump stand a chance in New Hampshire, the Trump team hasn't held a major event in the state since April, when they had Governor Doug Burgum, who was in the Veep stakes, in the running for that, going out to battleground states to campaign for Donald Trump. New Hampshire was a state that was in consideration back then. But the last time, again, Donald Trump has held a major event in New Hampshire was in April, and it wasn't even Donald Trump himself. And the Trump campaign volunteer that leaked this email, and then what we have seen in terms of those who have received the email and confirmed its validity to the Boston Globe and some of the contents of the email as well, the Trump team says this is not true. But you have to look at what they're actually doing. I mean, when they pulled out ads, and the LA Times reported on this, and many other major firms reported on the absence of advertisement spending in states like Ohio, Iowa, and New Hampshire, they denied all of these things. They gave BS excuses about how they were pulling their ads so they could reinvest right before the election, that they were going to drop a $50 million 3 days out from the election rather than focus on it right now 3 weeks out from the election. But they never ended up reinvesting that money. They never ended up going back into the state, because at some point in time, in crunch time, this is a month out from the election, this was 3 weeks before people voted on election day, the Trump team knew back in 2020 that New Hampshire was not a state. You can see they mentioned it here, but they mentioned it everywhere else. But again, the Trump team was very much in denial and saying, we are absolutely investing in this state, because the Trump team has this idea that they can sort of move beyond the narrative that has been built for them based on what actual fact and data has been released to the public. Right? When we get data points and we get emails like this that tell us what the campaign is thinking, it's very difficult to walk back on that and say, this guy isn't someone who can speak for the campaign, when you have multiple people who are confirming the validity of said email, equally are confirming many of these things that we're seeing cited. And it doesn't really fall too far out of line, right? Again, we saw that early pullback when the Republican Party didn't invest in the state until Biden's disastrous campaign performance, debate performance, according to the Republicans. Right? They looked at the debate, they said, this is disastrous for Biden. We are going to go ahead and move forward and reinvest in the state of New Hampshire. And when you take a look, too, at where Donald Trump and, Kamala Harris, where they have invested the most amount of money, not even in the top 10 comes in the state of New Hampshire. I mean, Kamala Harris has invested similar amounts to Nebraska's 2nd district, as well as New Hampshire. The Trump team has given roughly none. When we're looking at Donald Trump's campaign, when we're looking at, where they're investing the most amount of money, when they're spending the most amount of time, where they really think that their impact is going to be the most impactful, their influence and their campaign is going to be the most impactful, it's not in a state like New Hampshire. And so for them to have not held any events since April, to reinvest and announce they're finally going back in play after the debate, and then Kamala Harris comes in and starts doing a lot better in the head-to-head data in the state, it makes sense that they're deciding to pull out of it entirely. And while I do think there will be some level of presence from the Trump team, largely maybe to save face, or they'll do a singular campaign stop, or one singular rally, or even a fundraiser, maybe that would count as a Trump presence, or maybe they'll send out J.D. Vance because he's been trailing Kamala Harris for quite some time. Literally, you can see the campaign stops are nearly identical, just a day off or 2 days off. It's very possible he visits New Hampshire. Why? Because Kamala Harris is doing so. And I think this also speaks to a larger point that we've seen in this campaign, that age is an issue for the Democratic candidates up until the time that Joe Biden dropped out of the race. And a big part of that age concern for Democrats wasn't necessarily viability in electoral politics, meaning will voters come to vote for someone they believe is too old for the presidency, but also can Joe Biden campaign as much as somebody else who is at the top of the ticket. Joe Biden would do 1 or 2 campaign stops a week. Kamala Harris is doing 1 or 2 campaign stops a day. And that gives her time to visit states like New Hampshire. But I bring up age not for the Democratic Party, but now the Republican Party. In 2016, Donald Trump was holding 2, 3, sometimes 4 rallies a day across multiple states. Now, he's doing that at most across a 2-week span. On Labor Day, Kamala Harris visited both Michigan and Pennsylvania. Tim Walz was visiting other states, and Biden was on the campaign trail with Vice President Harris. Donald Trump, nowhere to be found. And I think, again, because of age, because Donald Trump is now 8 years older, his capacity and ability to campaign the same way he did 8 years ago, or even 4 years ago, has now dwindled tremendously. Because he's just 3 years younger than that of President Biden, it shows. And now he can't visit some of these states. In 2016, he spent his time, because he had so much of an opportunity to campaign, he went even out to Connecticut to campaign. And when they were running against Biden, they thought none of this mattered, so they went out to Wildwood, New Jersey. They went right next to the Six Flags and held a rally. They went to the Bronx in New York City because they thought they were going to run up the margin and they were going to send a shockwave to the nation, and that it didn't matter where he campaigned, how often he campaigned, but just that he did a little bit and he was going to beat Biden. That was their thinking. Now, Kamala Harris comes in full force, like those Amtraks that Joe Biden likes to ride, and you see here that she's going state to state to state, and she's going to New Hampshire. The Trump team, based on this email, and I'm sure we will see many selling signs over the coming months, because we will find, in the same way we did in 2020, I mean, literally, you are talking 3 years and 11 months from today was the time that the Trump team decided to withhold their advertisements in the state of New Hampshire. The news broke on it a week later. They were making all of these decisions less than 4 years ago because the data was showing that Donald Trump was not going to win this state. And I can imagine, with increased presence and involvement and advertisement spending from the Kamala Harris campaign, New Hampshire is only going to continue down this leftward path, just as it did between 2016 and 2020. And I do believe genuinely that Joe Biden did a phenomenal performance here for Democrats, even compared to that of many top Democrats in the past. I mean, Democrats really haven't had that much luck in New Hampshire. Prior to Bill Clinton, it was solidly conservative and Republican. But of recent days, Joe Biden is one of the better performing national Democrats. And when you take a look, too, what Kamala Harris has the ability to do, she can, in fact, run up this margin. And if this ends up actually coming to reality, where the Trump team schedules 0 campaign stops in New Hampshire, expects 0 presence, has just a few field offices, and runs $0 in advertisement spending, because they are, in fact, narrowing down to 7 states, and we will talk about this in a video tomorrow, how the Trump team seems to actually be honing in amongst the 7 down to Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona as a pathway to 270 electoral votes, and Nevada. We are going to be seeing here that New Hampshire might not only be on the back burner, but the back burner. Because at this point, these campaigns, both sides, really seem to be narrow lens and narrowing up on 7 battleground states. But the Kamala Harris campaign has time. They have energy. They have money. Today, they announced $25 million going to down-ballot races. It is unheard of, might I add, in a horse race where you are seeing 2 candidates so perfectly matched in terms of electoral chances. This is the best chances I think Donald Trump has faced in terms of pundit expectations in his entire 3 times running for the presidency. That doesn't mean he has a higher chance, though, in 2016. It just means the perception here is that it's a closer race. But even with that in mind, because of the cash surplus that Kamala Harris has, she raised $580 million since she announced her bid for the presidency just around a month and a half ago. $580 million, $500 million, when in 2020, the Biden campaign had raised just over $1 billion. You are talking about half of that huge sum of money that the Biden campaign had from 2020 being raised again in a month and a half for the Kamala Harris campaign. She has time, she has resources, she has enthusiasm, she has what it takes to focus on New Hampshire and the 7 battleground states. And it is clear today, and I think it will be even clearer in a month, that the Trump team is now pulling out of some states that in 2016 they heavily fought for. New Hampshire being one of them, Colorado being one of them, New Mexico being one of them, Virginia being one of them, Minnesota being one of them. Because in 2024, what do we know? The Trump team opened up 19 field offices in Minnesota and Virginia. With Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket, both of those states are going to be solidly Democratic. Not 15 points, not on that end, but more so. In terms of odds at victory, Kamala Harris has those in the bag. Colorado, New Mexico, same thing. Nebraska second, same thing. New Hampshire turning into the same thing. Because the Trump team, again, knows they're limited in resources, in campaign exposure, in Donald Trump's travel capabilities compared to 2020 and especially 2016. They know this election is very different for a variety of different reasons. Whether it be the top of the ticket Democrat, whether it be Donald Trump's age, whether it be fundraising, whether it be the failed assassination attempt, whether it be anything of this election. They know this race is different. but they know New Hampshire doesn't seem to be too excited about them at large. And I'll be interested to see how the Trump team decides to move forward in the state of New Hampshire. Do they save face and open up an additional campaign field office where Democrats rival them 10-1 in terms of field offices like they do in some other battleground states? Or do they decide to just entirely give it up? The Trump team can say as much as they want that they're still invested in putting resources into the state of New Hampshire, and they do believe they are the likeliest to win in that state. But it's the same tried and tested rhetoric that they gave in 2020 when we saw articles like these, where the Trump team was swearing up and down they weren't pulling out ads for any particular reason and that it was just a last-minute decision to go ahead and reinvest a week later. And that week later never came. This 2024 election cycle certainly has been interesting. States have gone in and out of being play, and it looks like it will be a very, very interesting campaign season to watch from the perspective from some not-so-swing battleground states that historically have been much more competitive and close, but this cycle, New Hampshire included, may no longer be in that category. And Democrats are hoping for a strong victory in New Hampshire, and chances are they'll get it. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.